Shabbat Shalom. Welcome to Stories from the Beginning. This is a project of the Orange County Board of Rabbis and Jewish Federation of Orange County. I'm Rabbi Sarah DePaolo from Congregation Shir and it is my honor, my privilege, joy to be with Rabbi Heather Miller this morning from Keeping It Sacred and Rabbi Joe Mendelsohn from the Reformed Temple of Laguna Woods. Good morning, Boker Tov.
Good morning, Boker Or.
All right, so Parashat Vayeshev. Let's get started. Let's dig in.
There is so much in this Torah portion. It's amazing to see. Obviously, it's the first of 4 that depict Joseph and his story. And it's so great to be discussing this with both of you, and then especially Rabbi Joe, your namesake. I would imagine growing up, you have a lot to say about this character and the story.
Yes, and as I got into seminary, I realized that my initial view of Joseph was a little different as I learned more about him and thought more about him. Actually, at seminary, I was asked to give a drash about Joseph, and I had 2 professors walk out because they were so upset. Joseph does not depict himself well. When you stop and think about it, he was favored, but as soon as we know he's favored, he shows off. He's given a God's gift. He's given a real gift of being able to tell dreams and interpret them. But at the same time, what does he do with that gift? He lords it over his brothers. He even lords it over his father and mother. And then he doesn't treat his family well at all. So there's no surprise that his brothers are going to be angry, hurt, and want revenge. And this story is really about that initial revenge of his brothers. And then he becomes a catalyst in moving our story along. I really wonder whether anyone feels that because of his gift, he's there in the stories, but is he there to be a role model for being a mensch?
I think what's difficult or interesting about this portion, especially because we're given Joseph when he's younger, right? But his story continues over the course of 3, almost 4 portions. And he really goes through some real development and some change and transformation. But certainly at the beginning of the portion, yeah, he's a teenager and he doesn't come off great.
Yeah, we see him at 17. I mean, how much can a person, mature over their life? We really see his maturation during this. I think one aspect, right, I've been known to give Esav the, good guy, bad guy, different lenses. I love, that our tradition recognizes Shivim Panim LaTorah, that there are 70 faces of the Torah. So just to kind of look at him from another angle, right, this idea that he came from this family, from a father who understood what, sibling rivalry was about, who understood what it was like to not be the favored son of his father initially, right? Because Isaac favored Esau, not Jacob, and now Jacob is favoring the youngest brother and not the eldest brother, not Reuven. We also have this blended family, and I think that that's a really interesting mix as well, right? He didn't choose this fate, right? He was born into it. He was the eldest son of Rachel. And the dynamics there are so interesting because Jacob loved Rachel. And when he married, he thought he was marrying Rachel, but then he got Leah, the older sister. He had to work in Laban's house for another 7 years. And then he was able to marry Rachel. And in the meantime, he had kids with Leah's servant, with Rachel and Rachel's servant. And Rachel's eldest child was Joseph. So of course he's going to favor him. He was born into this situation where he was his father's most loved wife and the eldest son of that. So that idea, he was one of the youngest ones. He was the second from the youngest. And so when he was 17 and his father is finally so happy that he's matured in this way, he gives him this coat of many colors. So, you know, when someone is brought up in that situation of a blended family, and there's clearly, it's the father's projecting onto him the love that he has for the mother, that I don't know that we can always blame Joseph 100% for that, right? Like there's family dynamics there. And I think they're really instructive in today's society. I think this is a wonderful, wonderful text for blended families to recognize the birth order and the differences and the projections of the, you know, the ex-wife's kids versus the new wife's kids. And like, what does that look like? There's so much there to think about in terms of family dynamics, and to just be sensitive about those dynamics.
I completely agree. And I think Jacob plays into those family dynamics. It feels like Jacob has not learned from his childhood. He has not matured in the same way that we would hope, but he's aware of how the other brothers see Joseph. He's received one of Joseph's dream interpretations at that point, and he got kind of frustrated with Joseph when he heard it, shouting, like, does this mean you think you're going to lord it over your mother and me as well? And then what does he do? He sends Joseph out to go check up on his older brothers, even though he's aware, and the text literally says that he is sensitive to this situation, but he still sends Joseph out into the field to go check up on the older brothers and to report back on them.
I appreciate everything that's being said, but at the same time, one has to accept responsibility for one's actions. And the consequences of the way he acts. I'm still in disagreement. You know, number one, age is not maturity. Maturity is developing who you are and how you're going to react with others. And I see him when later on with his brothers being deceitful again. I don't see it being a warm thing. You know, we're also affected to some degree by what our tradition tells us, because if you look at the initial texts in Breshit Rabbah and Or Chaim and so on, our sages are telling us, well, Joseph was really trying to be good and the brothers are at fault. And I don't see that completely either. You know, blended families still have to interact together and love each other and work together. And it requires everybody to be part of that. When one person lords it over the others, even if it's his situation in this case, or hers in another family, you know, this has to be worked out. And I don't see the effort. The gift that he's given, though, however, is amazing, because this gift really allows our story to move further. It allows us to see Joseph as a catalyst for God giving instructions. And it also allows God's prophecy of putting us into slavery to happen. You know, if Joseph hadn't been the one, the key figure in giving the Pharaoh the interpretation of the 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine, how could we move on? But again, that's another
a little later.
That's another week. Right now, we're dealing with the dynamics of brothers really being so upset with Joseph coming in, and you know, I think that the sensitivity of let's not kill him, but sell him to the Ishmaelites or the other possible people that we see in that one verse. You know, there's three possibilities. I think that gives us a glimmer of how some of the brothers are going to mature and become better in the story.
I also think it's interesting how Judah and Reuben, particularly, how they interact with Joseph, how they interact with the other brothers, and that Judah gets his own kind of like shoot off story in this week's Torah portion as well. I think indicative of the fact of the leader he's going to become, or he could become as well. That he and Tamar also play a role in advancing the Jewish people's story in a very different way than Joseph. That they eventually, their union, their coupling, brings about Perez, who's going to be great grandfather of King David.
Yeah, and we also see Judah becoming a mensch in that story, starting out wanting to get rid of Joseph. And at the end, it really takes a lot in, again, taking Heather's concept of how you're born into a situation and where you are, being able to say to Tamar, you know what, you're right. He didn't have to do that. He didn't have to say, you're right. He could have just let the whole thing play out. And I think that really is an indication of Judah's growth. So I agree with you completely.
So interesting, because the thread through this whole parashat really, to me, looks also like the question between taking your own fate into your own hands, the way that Tamar did. She said, no, I must have a child. And she just, her first husband died. Onan, her second husband, died. So she took her fate into her own hand to be with with Judah. But then on the other hand, you have Joseph, who's just kind of going through life, and God is providing for him throughout. So it's this really beautiful interplay between the question of, is God really present in the background of our lives and making good things happen? A quick aside that I discovered in rabbinical school, that Potiphar actually is, in the gematria, the Hebrew numerology, equivalent to Shekhinah, which also is like an amazing thing, right? Was Shekhinah there the whole time? Was God there the whole time? Later on in chapter 45, it talks about God was there the whole time and making this happen, versus Tamar, who really has to take her own fate into her own hands and make her way. It's that question of, do you wait for your ship to sail in, or do you swim out to it? So what do you make of that whole idea of fate or faith?
It's a combination of the two. I mean, God being present in our lives, I have no question. I always feel that God has really opened doors for me and put down barriers. But I have to recognize that the door is open. I have to recognize the barrier first, and that the barrier is now gone. Otherwise, I'm going to be stagnant. So it is a combination of the two.
I really appreciate that personal interpretation, Joe. But I have to admit, when I read the Tamar story, I see a story about power and access to power as well. That women, particularly women in biblical stories, do have to make their own fate in a lot of times, that they have to create their own destiny. Whereas somebody like Joseph can rely on faith to see doors open for him. And he does recognize when things are opening for him, but he doesn't have to be such an active actor in his life, it seems. But Tamar does, because of power, because of access to power, that's how she's able to make her way in the world and make a huge difference ultimately in our story.
And in our tradition, in our people, in our people's story. Really appreciate that.
Right. Now, at the end of the story, where we see Joseph doing the interpretations of the cupbearer's dream and the baker's dream, there we start to see a glimmering of Joseph understanding that the gift he has is given by God, and he's giving God some credit for it. So yes, we start to see that Joseph is recognizing what he's got, and that he is an active participant in this gift, and it's the combination of the faith and the ability to do. But it's still, the personal development that goes with it really needs to work.
And that's the beauty, right? That's one of the first times you see his humility, actually, in his act of interpreting these dreams. He becomes known as the dream interpreter, but he says, "Who, me? Like, this isn't my gift. This is right from somewhere else. This isn't something that, usually he would want to be like the best, and he's, the best son, the favorite son, the one with this coat." But here you start seeing a bit of his humility creep in, and that maturation throughout. Prison time was good for him, right? That he was able to kind of humble himself and be thoughtful about who he was, and start to understand his place in the bigger society, in the broader world.
And I think that brings up then another good point, in that is, in our society, we have to recognize that people who have been in prison are not necessarily bad people and will remain bad people. And our society has a very bad record in dealing with people who have been released from jail and bringing them back into the world and accepting them as constructive citizens.
And that's also assuming that everyone in jail was found guilty, right? That there's so much pre-trial jailing that happens that disrupts people's lives. And if you can't pay bail, then you're going to be there, and that's going to completely interrupt your life, even if later you are found innocent. So yeah, absolutely. I think that those are.
And that really feels like a question of fate and faith, and who has access to changing their fate in that situation in particular. And that your ability to access certain things really does change how society views you as well. And that Joseph, who for the early part of his life was seen as the golden boy, now doesn't have access to those sorts of things.
Right.
And what a beautiful tradition. Oops, sorry.
Oh, no, please. What were you going to say?
I was just going to say what a beautiful tradition we have, that we have the Birkat HaGomel, right? The blessing when a person comes out of jail, to accept them back into society and to allow them a chance to give praise for being free, right? That, it's that that liberatory moment again expressed. So yeah, I think that this idea that people who were in prison can become reincorporated into society is a Jewish value in that, as well as evidenced by this story about Joseph coming into his own. Sarah, I think you were going to share something.
Oh, what I was going to say is I think but I think it's interesting, right, that fate isn't done with Joseph yet. The portion ends with Joseph asking the cupbearer to remember him, remember that I made this prophecy, this dream interpretation for you, and bring that back to Pharaoh. And the cupbearer goes back to Pharaoh and has forgotten Joseph. And that it's a little bit of a cliffhanger at the end of the portion.
You just reminded me, right? We're talking, so he's supposed to zachor, right? He's supposed to remember him. And earlier in the Torah portion, right, when Joe, you were talking about Jacob wanting to shamor, he was guarding the situation, right? On Shabbat, we have shamor and zachor. And in this Torah portion, we also have shamor and zachor, right? And what I'm talking about is in the 10 Commandments, right? We have the 10 Commandments twice in the Torah. We've got it in Exodus and Deuteronomy. And at one point it says we should zachor et ha-Shabbat, we should remember Shabbat. And another place we have shamor et ha-Shabbat, to guard Shabbat. So it's I thank you so much, Sarah, because I didn't even put those two things together. And Joe, right, talking about shamor at the beginning and zachor here. I wonder if there's some sort of connection there between Joseph and Shabbat and the candles. And he was failed on both of those accounts. He wasn't guarded, right? He was put in this pit, and then he wasn't remembered, at least initially, right? That he was forgotten by that cupbearer as well.
That sounds like a midrash that needs to be written.
Probably. Well, I'm just waiting till next week, because now we've got the cliffhanger we've raised wonderful, wonderful concepts of the value of someone who's gone through a negative experience and coming out positive, taking fate into your hands, recognizing God's involvement in our lives. I just want to thank you two for really giving us such a great conversation.
Thank you.
You as well.
Well, Shabbat Shalom, friends. We hope you'll tune in next week.
And happy Hanukkah.
Happy Hanukkah.
Take care, all.